Okay, today we're going to look at some of the reforms that have happened with parties and the changes that have happened over time. And this is going to keep with that theme that we've had throughout this entire unit of the weaknesses of party, the decline of parties. So we're going to start with the historical abuses that have happened in political parties. What we saw is that this was when the control of nominations were done by party bosses, the leaders of the party hand-picking nominees, and they would do this through caucuses and conventions. And the mindset there was you had a kingmaker who would pick the nominees, get them into office, and then control them once in office. You also saw that there was a lot of corruption in political machines. This is another historical abuse of parties. This using government jobs to curry favors with voters and abusing those powers to make sure that you had loyal people supporting you. And then the unrepresentative nature of parties. Young people, poor people, minorities were often overlooked historically in political parties. So some things were done to kind of address these abuses, and that's where we got the progressive era and a lot of reforms. First, you have the direct primary elections, now letting the people pick their nominees so that the parties become more responsive and representative of the people's desires. You have nonpartisan elections at the state and local level. So these are races where party identification is not even part of the factors. You run just on name and reputation alone. We had expansion of the civil service, so taking away those jobs that were favors for people and now making it competitive to get jobs. And we had the institution of the initiative, referendum, and recall, letting citizens vote directly on pieces of legislation, letting their voice be heard at the ballot box rather than having to go through the elected officials who could potentially be corrupt. And finally, the 17th Amendment, allowing people to directly elect their senators. Another era, progressive era reform that came out to address some of the abuses and some of the control mechanisms that had been put in place by party leaders to make sure that they got what they wanted. Now, the argument is that we've seen a de-alignment in political parties, that people are kind of rejecting parties altogether and not really removing and realigning to new parties, but just rejecting the idea of the two main parties in general. And that's the evidence for that is pointed to with the growth of independents, that we've seen a steady increase in independents to make up, a large percentage of our electorate these days. And you see a lot more ticket splitting happening where people are voting for both Democrat and Republican. And you see a lot more people voting for the man, not the party, voting for someone because of who they are, not necessarily what party they identify with. Now, you could argue, though, that what ends up happening is that some of these independents really do lean towards one party or the other and are not pure, true independents. So there is some counter-argument to this de-alignment theory. One other area of reform I want to talk about is what the Democratic Party did in the 1970s and 80s. And what they did is they started to open itself up, and they developed a system to bring more people in. And this was in the 1970s, the McGovern-Fraser Commission. Part of this was to encourage young people to take part in activities and to develop a quota system to ensure that young women and minorities were representative in party affairs, especially at the convention. Now, the result of this is that you got a lot more liberal candidates in the 1970s and 80s, and those immediately led to defeats at the presidential level. So in a short-term strategy, it was a very poor choice for the Democrats as far as gaining electoral victories. However, if you fast forward to current day, if you look at the victory of President Obama in 2012, his victory was built on the backs of the gender gap and the way that women voted for him more so than Mitt Romney. It was built on minority support, 70% of the Hispanic vote, over 90% of the African American vote, and it was built on young people being engaged and active. So some of these reforms that in the short term of the 70s and 80s were disastrous for the Democrats as far as presidential politics now have served to form the basis of the coalition that put President Obama into office in 2008 and got him reelected in 2012. So long term, it might be a good strategy for the Democratic Party.